Welcome to Positive Parenting Practices on behalf of Lee Summit Cares. My name is Kerri Grey, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm also a mother of four, and I do a lot of work in teaching the Love and Logic parenting classes, as well as presenting information on topics related to health and wellness. Today, our focus for this webinar is how to flatten the stress curve. And so specifically, we're going to give you a better understanding of what stress is and essentially what are some of the symptoms that people are under stress and just essentially that how it impacts people might be different. You're also going to learn healthy stress management strategies. And finally, we're going to wrap up by giving you some ideas for creating your own stress management plan and some tips for helping your children to develop a plan as well. So let's start by defining what is stress. Essentially, stress occurs when something is perceived as difficult to deal with. This could range from anywhere from getting in front of a crowd of people and having to do public speaking, to working in your garden and finding a slithering snake is watching you. I have experienced that one. What we do know is that stress is very much an individual experience. So what that means is what might be very stressful to me may not at all be stressful to another person. So we need to be mindful of that. Finally, we know that stress is impacted by a person's genetics, their state of health, and also their prior experiences. And so if someone is dealing with some chronic health issues, that will make them more vulnerable to the impacts of stress. Also, when we look at prior experiences, we can look at that in two ways. One would be reflecting on how you experienced a stressful event in the past. So you might have some assumptions about the future based on that experience, but also prior experiences and how you've watched the adults in your life deal with stress. And that's a point that we're going to come back to more in this webinar. So stress essentially is something that we experience as individuals on a continuum. And we know that stress, as we look at this diagram, is related to our performance. And so there's certainly something that is referred to in science as an optimal stress level, which is essentially right here in our middle zone. We find that when people are experiencing an optimal level of stress, that they tend to have a better sense of focus and concentration, and they're ready to accomplish whatever it is that they're needing to accomplish. An example of this would be an athlete who's becoming nervous and before they compete, but being able to manage that feeling or that stressor to a point that it just focuses on enhancing their performance rather than making it so that they're unable to perform, which can happen when people experience stress overload. So we don't want to be on either end of the continuum, meaning a person who just doesn't care and is disengaged, versus being in a place where we're experiencing so much stress that our mental health and our physical health starts to break down, because that's not a healthy place for us to be. So we're going to move forward and talk about the differences between those two places and what we can do to stay more on the healthy side. So we know that in life, stress is unavoidable and that not all stress is considered bad. For example, encountering a snake in your garden while you're working, to me, that would be a bad stressor, if you will. But stress can come in wonderful forms, like welcoming a new baby to the household, or maybe retiring and moving on to the next phase of life. But we need to break up stress in terms of looking at it as adaptive or helpful stressors that we experience. And then what do we do when we're experiencing what is referred to as stress overload? So with adaptive stress, what happens is that our central nervous system is activated and put on alert. So you might experience your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, you're focused, you're ready to go, you have more concentration, and you really focus on what you need to do in order to stay safe or respond to whatever that threat is in your environment. This is how we stay alive. And this is obviously a very important part of our anatomy. But when we experience stress for a prolonged period of time, especially when there is no end in sight, such as what many people are experiencing related to COVID, what we oftentimes see happening is that the body becomes fatigued because the central nervous system is in a constant state of arousal. And so it's difficult to disengage and to take a break and to calm down. And so that wearing and tearing on the central nervous system affects a person's ability to think clearly, prioritize, problem solve. It also starts to have detrimental effects on physical health in terms of people start experiencing a lot of physical complaints that often send them to the doctor's office. And so it's important to recognize that some stress is a very positive thing and very adaptive, and it helps us to survive. But other forms of stress, when stress lasts too long, it can become very counterproductive and destructive. And so today we're going to talk, as I said, about how do we stay on more of the healthy side. First, let's be able to identify when a child or our teenager is feeling stress, because symptoms of stress in young children and teens might look a little bit different than what they're going to look like in an adult. For example, for young children, we have a neighbor who just brought a new baby home. And a typical stress response to that exciting event would be kind of reassurance seeking, making sure that they still have their place, if they will. They could be more clingy, reluctant to separate from the parents, might be complaining more about headaches, stomach aches, and some even regress to previously mastered skills. And so an example of that would be a younger child who has been potty trained successfully, for 6 months now is suddenly having accidents. The child might have trouble sleeping, and we might see them having tantrums and meltdowns. And a lot of that is just tied into their inability to totally understand what they're experiencing and being able to experience, or rather express, those thoughts, those feelings, and what they're needing at the time. Now, as kids get older, especially as they move into the tween or the teen years, when they start to enter into puberty, what we find is they're more likely to withdraw from the family, from social situations. Another indicator of a high level of stress might be where they stop doing things that they used to enjoy doing. They might say, I'm really having trouble sleeping, or I'm not hungry. And certainly moodiness and irritability is a part of the teenage years, but this might be even more exasperated in a teen who's experienced higher levels of stress. Just like our younger kids and us as adults, physical symptoms are also pretty common, including tension in the shoulders, headaches, stomach aches, difficulty concentrating. And so the main point here is with the younger kids, you're going to see more of the behavioral responses and wonder, what's going on with this kid? And they're not being naughty. They're just not able to express themselves appropriately. Whereas with older kids who are more verbal and able to express themselves, we're going to start seeing the mind-body connection, meaning how it affects a person, mentally, physically, through their relationships, etc. And so, and that can be a guidepost for you as well. And so teens, I just want to spend another minute on this because they have a higher risk factor, meaning that they're a little bit more vulnerable to stress. And it's important to understand why as we dive deeper into what can we do about it and how can we help our kids. One of the reasons why is that their brain is not fully developed until at least about 25 years of age. So what that means is they naturally have limited coping resources. And so that just has to do with the general structure of their brain. Even though a teenager may look like an adult, they do not think like adults, and it's important to remember that. Another thing that we need to be aware of is their use of technology. Technology is the way in which kids of this generation communicate. And so because of that, they're going to be exposed more to things that are happening around them. They're going to be aware of events. We can't shelter them from events, and they're even going to want to get online and post their thoughts and feelings about them, but they also still may be confused about where they stand. Another thing is that many teens might be referred to as having more of an avoidant personality, and this is when we start to see our kids spending more time away from the family, more time with peers, but also more time alone when they're home. They really appreciate their privacy and their space. And subsequently, this can cause them to internalize their feelings instead of being able to talk about them, which ties into the lack of, and this is an important word, perceived support. And so it is difficult for our teens to ask for help. And so it's important that we keep our door open to them and check in with them just to see how they're doing. And we'll talk about how to do that. We also know that if they're in the house more, their physical activity isn't as high. They are tended to be more emotionally reactive. And that is not because they're just drama kings or drama queens. It essentially ties back to that brain development. And because of how the brain develops from back to front, what we find is that our teens experience emotions on a much more intense level than we do as adults. And finally, the last thing is the perfectionistic tendencies. Our teenagers are very sometimes referred to as narcissistic, but they're also very self-reflective and self-critical. And so they're their worst judge of themselves. And so all of these factors make teens certainly a little bit more vulnerable, as if you will, when dealing with the stressors of life. So what can we do about that? So here are some different quadrants to think about, and we're going to go deeper into managing thoughts and feelings in a healthy way in the next slide. So I'm going to start by focusing on what experts say are impactful in reducing our stress, but also in helping us to become more resilient, whether that's me as an adult or my child. And so the first thing is movement. And what that basically means is getting up and getting some exercise, you know, whether that's bringing the dog for a walk, or maybe it's going to the gym, or maybe it's taking a class through an online app. But the point is that when we get up and get moving, that provides a lot of healthy chemical responses in our body that actually naturally make us feel better and reduce our sense of stress and anxiety. In fact, research shows that even going outside for a walk in a green space for just 10 minutes will improve your happiness, overall happiness. It will decrease depression and anxiety. And so that's one of the strategies that we should incorporate into our everyday activities, because taking breaks and getting out and moving is definitely something that is helpful. Another one is sleep, which can be a real challenge for our teens. And so ideally, what the research shows is that anyone should get anywhere from 7 minimal to 9 hours of sleep a night. Yet when we look at our own sleep patterns and the patterns of our older kids especially, we might find that they're not getting near that sleep. And that's a real problem because of the restorative properties that sleep provides us, such as cell restoration, which helps to improve our immunities. None of those things happen when we're not getting adequate sleep. Some people will argue, well, you know, I only need 4 or 5 hours of sleep. But the reality is there's few outliers that can actually function well on fewer than 7 hours of sleep. In fact, if you look closer at that situation, you're likely to find that the person is using a lot of caffeine in order to keep themselves moving forward. And so making sure that your kids are getting plenty of sleep, maybe even setting some limits on technology use before bedtime, at least an hour before bedtime, removing those devices and not allowing your kids, especially teenagers, to have their phone in their room, will certainly help aid in getting them that restorative sleep that they need. Now, they're not going to appreciate you for this. And so this is an example of when you are the parent, not the friend, and you just need to set that limit and say, I love you too much to argue. Another one we often hear about in terms of stress management is eating right, good nutrition, eating 3 healthy meals a day. What we find is that how we eat, or the foods that we use to nourish our bodies, have a large impact on how we feel. And for example, we know that foods that are high in sugar concentrations have an inflammatory characteristic, so they make us feel bad. And so being mindful of the food that you're fueling your body with and that you're making available to your kids is critical. We started getting concerned when we were in the COVID stay-at-home owners, because we noticed our youngest 14-year-old was eating kind of geared towards more of the junk food, which, you know, who wouldn't be? Junk food tastes good. And one of her older sisters said, you know, you might not bring that junk food into the house, so it's not available, light bulb. And so that availability is important. Be real intentional in the types of snacks and things that are there in your household for them, but also practice moderation. The next one here is relationships. We know that in building our resilience or our ability to bounce back from stressful situations, relationships are critical. And so being very intentional in taking time to connect with loved ones, with friends, even when you don't feel like it. Oftentimes, if you just go, you know, get together, afterwards, you're going to be glad that you did, or it's going to feel good that you made that phone call, or you had that face-to-face Zoom video with the loved one whom you haven't spoken with in a while. Just make it happen. The positive feelings will come. Then the next one is the managing thoughts and feelings in a healthy way. And this one's more complicated. And so I've created an additional slide to kind of break this down a little bit. So what does that mean exactly? First off, our brain is a powerful tool. I often ask people, who is in charge, the thought or the thinker? And the correct answer is the thinker. Well, our thoughts will come automatically depending on situations. What we're learning in science is that we can direct our thinking in a more positive way. And so how do we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is to be aware of our thought patterns. When we encounter situations, our brain's job is to keep us safe. And so our brain is naturally going to see most everything as a threat, even though it may not be. And so it's oftentimes functioning on information that is not accurate. So what that might look like would be, let's say that, you know, when things were closing or closed during COVID, you know, your natural thought is, oh my goodness, you know, what if I lose my job? And that can easily move into catastrophic thinking. Well, if I lose my job, I'm going to lose my car, I'll lose my house, I won't have any place to live, all right? And that type of thinking is not helping you. That thinking is hurting you. And so instead of letting that catastrophic thinking or ruminating take charge, it's important for us to step back and say, you know, it's possible that I could get laid off, but if I do, I have a lot of marketable skills and there's other things that I can do. I also have some savings that I can draw upon, and I'm just going to take this one day at a time. All right, so that would be more of how we manage our thought processes. Another thing to be that is really important is to practice self-compassion. Oftentimes we are very critical of ourselves, just like with the teenager I mentioned in the previous slide. And so it's important to step back and say, or to ask our teen, what would you tell your very best friend in this situation? What would you tell a loved one? And how can you apply that to yourself? How could you be nicer to yourself in this situation? Because compassion in general really needs to start with self-compassion, treating ourselves in the way in which we often treat others, right? Another one is to engage in mindfulness practices, which you'll find a lot of information on that online. But essentially, mindfulness practices offer ways in which to calm your central nervous system. And oftentimes the focus is on breathing exercises, being able to be present in a situation without thinking about the future or worrying about past decisions, and just not to have any type of judgment, just to be. And that is a practice that takes time to develop, but is showing more and more research-based studies that show that it's very effective as a stress management tool. And so if you're interested in mindfulness practices, there are different apps that are available, such as 10% Happier, Calm is another one that you might be aware of. Headspace is another one. A lot of them provide a free trial. So if you want to get into what that means in terms of mindfulness practices, there's an opportunity for you to check it out. Some people benefit from journaling what they're feeling when they're feeling overwhelmed, especially if I can't sleep at night. Sometimes I'll get up and I'll write down what's bothering me and put it in the drawer and know that that's something that I'm going to deal with in the morning. Some people benefit from being creative. I have two daughters who love to do arts and crafts. And so they'll just, pull out the paint and things, and that is their self-soothing activity. Others like to listen to music, and sometimes we just need to take a break, to walk away and do something that you enjoy. All right. So those are some different, very basic, if you will, stress management strategies, but important in that we need to start first with our thought patterns and be tuned into that so that we can be aware of how those thoughts influence our feelings. Then we can choose how we need to re-guide things with more self-compassion, if you will. So what can you do to help your kids deal with stress? Well, the number one thing that you can do is model positive self-management strategies. And I would even take this further. You might be going for a run or whatever it is that you're doing, or maybe you're taking a break to, go outside for a little while. But it's important to intentionally talk about, I'm just really stuck with this situation, or I'm feeling stressed out. I think what I need to do is take a break for a little while. Or maybe I need to call a friend, or I'm going to go and take a hot bath. That always helps me to calm down and feel better. But to intentionally talk about what you're doing to manage your stress. The second thing you can do is to be empathetic, with your kids and validate their feelings. Remember, especially with teenagers, they experience their feelings, their emotions on a much more intense level than we do. And so you might be looking at them like, oh my goodness, what is going on with you right now? But the reality is when you tell a teenager, oh, calm down, or you're really making a big deal out of nothing, you actually make it more difficult for the teenager to manage those feelings. And so instead, it's important to be empathetic and to validate what they're feeling, even if you personally don't think it's a big deal. You may have heard of the expression, you have to name it to tame it. Well, once we identify and acknowledge that feeling, then we could step into, well, why are we feeling that way? All right. And that goes right into our next step. Help your child develop some stress managed strategies. And some of that is through that modeling and talking out loud, and just letting them know that dealing with stress is different for everyone. And what works for me might not work for you, but there's a lot of things out there that you can try. And you need to give it time to know if it's going to work or not. But there are things that you can do to manage the stress that you're experiencing. And finally, two last things. One would be asking, how can I help? And that's an important question to ask your kids and your teenagers, because what you think might be causing them a great deal of stress may not actually be it at all. And so identifying with, what is stressing you out most about having to isolate from your friends, for example. It might not be that they're missing out on graduation and other things, but that perhaps they just wanted to wear that prom dress and they're not getting that prom. Well, once it's safe, there's probably a way in which we could still have the kids dress up for prom and take pictures and go out to eat. So knowing what it is and not making assumptions about what that stressor is really important. And certainly we do need to be mindful of, if our kid is really not coping very well for a period of time, we might need to seek some professional help. And so the key here with an anxiety disorder or depression, one of the hallmarks of an anxiety disorder is when people with anxiety experience heightened levels of worry or fear, even when there is little or no reason. All right. And oftentimes people know this on some level, but they're just unable to get out of that anxiety trap and stay focused on just carrying out everyday living activities. Now, depression is a mood disorder, and it's something that lasts for more than 2 weeks. And it affects a person's ability to carry out, work, daily tasks, school, and it also affects the whole person. So with either of these, we're looking for a dramatic change in behavior that lasts for a period of time, at least 2 weeks, and is interfering with that child's ability to have form relationships, if you will, and to just carry out the functions of their everyday life. That's when it's a good idea to go ahead, pick up the phone, make a call and see what you can do to get that situation evaluated. And sometimes the first place to go is to your pediatrician or doctor's office. Then here, are some other hotlines and things that you can reach out to. So I included the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, because if you have a child who is expressing, talking about suicide, being a burden to others, wanting to die, talking about how they would do it, expressing feelings of hopelessness, this is never going to end, this is unbearable. If you're noticing things like drug or alcohol use, or even a kid engaging in reckless behavior, those are big warning signs, and we need to pay close attention to that and take the steps that are needed in order to keep our child safe. Some of the things that might trigger that type of thought process would be a loss. Maybe they had a relationship, that they broke up, or they lost their job, or maybe a kid's been kicked out of school or can't be at school. They're feeling isolated or cut off from the world. We know that access to lethal means is also a precipitating event. And so people who have, for example, guns in their home need to make sure that they're put in a place where they're locked and not accessible to our kids and our teens. That perceived lack of support, perceived again, could be there. We also know that decreased pain sensitivity is a precipitating event. So kids who cut on themselves might be more likely to follow through with an act of violence towards themselves, such as suicide. Also exposure to violence or death, loss of a loved one could be another precipitating event. But as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to ignore these things. If we have healthcare insurance, we're going to pick up the phone and see what resources there are for you. You can go to the community mental health center if you do not have insurance. And these are some different numbers that you could call that are 24/7, multilingual, to help you sort through your specific situation and figure out what is the best course of action. So finally, I want to thank you for listening today. If you would like to have more information on upcoming parenting classes, we hope to start those in the fall. And you can also visit our resources at leesummitcares.org. That's our website. So you'll learn about not just the parenting classes, but also webinars that are coming. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope that you find that this information has been helpful to you.